Good morning. I would like to thank Heritage Education Network Belize and all its directors for accepting my presentation for this year's Culture Symposium. Thank you for providing this important and accessible platform for the Belizean community and beyond. Belize, Australia, and New Zealand share similar colonial pasts and similar treatment of their non-European population. There were a series of historical events that happened in Australia and New Zealand that I will not elaborate here that set them on a path of tolerance, acceptance, and ownership. Community Heritage Management, or CHM, is basically the management of local heritage with equal participation between the local communities and the outside parties like archaeologists, anthropologists, researchers, local organizations, institutions, the state, and/or international organizations. It should not be confused with cultural heritage management because the term cultural could encompass natural identity, whereas community denotes the local community. State and organizations that practice cultural instead of community heritage management tends to alienate the local community. This is important because heritage and the local community are interconnected. The building blocks of heritage are basically the local community's customs, values, so without the local community, heritage becomes abstract. Most states and international organizations continues to use the term preservation instead of conservation and cultural instead of community. The term preservation and conservation are used interchangeably, but they have separate meanings that are irreconcilable. One involves the local community while the other omits the local community or the people aspect in policymaking and enforcement of heritage sites. Preservation means to protect and safeguard the heritage regardless of the needs of the local community, while conservation means to include the human elements into the heritage management policy by including the full participation of the local community. The first component is community. Community is a multifaceted and politically charged concept with meanings and consequences that can be altered with a simple change in its situation. Depending on the situation, different priorities will become important and directly influence the purpose of community heritage engagement. Community and heritage work hand in hand in that heritage is the building blocks that define a community by its custom, language, landscape, history, artifacts, and monuments. Heritage is flexible as it can be constructed and reconstructed according to time and place, as such community are also constantly changing with different needs and concerns. A second component is local. Local denotes people who live and utilize the resources at or close to and around heritage sites. Local is important because local heritage value immediately influence and impact the local community, whereas heritage interests of other levels or scale are less important. However, local interests in heritage are often viewed as being less significant than those of national or world heritage levels, as if it is measured by the number of people involved. This is a problem because a global stakeholder has no personal knowledge of the World Heritage Site itself, but the traditional owners that live and spend most of his or her life in and around the World Heritage Site does. So, for non-local global stakeholder to make preservation policy is a fundamentally flawed practice, even if they are state or national level stakeholders. In Australian CHM, the local is more important than what might interest global stakeholder. Another essential component is diversity. When dealing with CHM, one has to understand that each and every project should be approached as a case-by-case basis based on the context and the local community. Australian Aborigines are not a single cultural group, but instead it is actually made of indigenous community that are diverse in language, specific customs, and the nature of kin relations, economic practices, and so forth. As such, community-based engagement should be diverse and varies according to social, cultural, political demands of the individual community. Current CHM projects in Australia are a response to this diversity of cultural, historical, and life experience of Indigenous people. Models adopted for CHM has to be flexible and locally specific. Each heritage engagement has to be developed and adopted at the local community level. What works for one community may not work for another. Recognizing this diversity component is thus essential. Perhaps the most important component in practicing CHM is decolonization. This partnership between Indigenous people and the various state and private organizations should be conceived as long-term, local community-driven, collaborative projects that gave power back to the traditional owner. To achieve the goal of decolonizing archaeology, this collaboration should accept and include the Indigenous people as full partners in the pursuit of understanding the past while making it relevant to the present, because it is the right thing to do. It is important then that all collaboration projects between Indigenous community and archaeologists should employ mutually acceptable research agenda, work practices, and interpretive framework so to directly and indirectly benefit the local community. Traditional owners should be central to the managing of their heritage, with archaeology as a prominent component in achieving community-identified priorities in land and heritage management. Archaeological projects should be secondary to the empowering and production of outcomes that are greater than the archaeological inquiries that ultimately benefit the local community and their heritage. Decolonization seeks to allow the return of ownership and control of community heritage back to the traditional owner by having meaningful engagement and giving them power to make decisions and action that will benefit their heritage. Part of returning power to the Indigenous people is recognizing them as traditional owners instead of as stakeholders. CHM-based research aims to empower community by contributing to the construction of local identity. The term stakeholder is commonly used in the heritage management industry as it presents the notion that all parties have a voice in the management process. But by labeling them as stakeholders, it completely avoided the issue of ownership and reduced them to just mere participants in the management of their own heritage and lands. Similarly, the term stakeholder goes beyond community place and geographical boundaries. For example, international businesses can be stakeholders. Acknowledging Indigenous people as traditional owner instead gave the power and ownership back to them, creating a host-guest relationship, outsider being the guest. Instead of a parent-child relationship, the parent or protector being the government or outside expert. Such restructuring allowed the traditional owner to become the leading partners and controllers of their own heritage, which is fitting as traditional owners don't see themselves as owning the land, but instead they are connected to it and thus have the responsibility to look after it. A final component to CHM is that everything is heritage. Heritage is commonly perceived as tangible, material evidence, sites, but this is misleading because it can also be intangible as in customs and practices. Practice is the link between people and material culture. Our daily routines is a form of ritual or simply practice. Constructed from belief, stories, and how we see the world around us, practice is performed in particular setting and landscape that may subject to changes over time. Basically, phenomenological and experiential understanding are heritage and must be consulted as evidence in interpretations. Additionally, a heritage landscape does not only consist of the physical environments, nature and man-made, but also the traditions, cultural perceptions, stories, practices, and the relationship between the community and the land. Archaeologists need to be willing to risk stepping outside of the intellectual boundaries and engage critically with non-archaeological knowledge and values. Traditional owners has to be consulted in order to facilitate an exchange of ideas and an exchange of the archaeologists' separate and shared knowledge system. Reversing the usual consultation pattern where now the expert reacts to the community-driven agenda rather than the community reacting to an archaeological agenda. Put archaeology in the service of the local indigenous heritage with anthropology in order to better understand and appreciate indigenous practices. Archaeological sites are spaces that provide access to webs of meaning and connection for indigenous people. They are part of the production and reproduction of indigenous knowledge. CHM should be a holistic approach to archaeological practice incorporating both material and non-material culture realms. In conclusion, the key reason as to why community-based heritage research and partnership in Australia and New Zealand are progressive is because they approach heritage management practice with the understanding that it is not about preservation as though no one lives at these heritage sites anymore, but more of a conservation approach where they embrace the fact that these heritage sites are alive with contemporary inhabitants. They learn from their not too so distant past and work towards giving back the control and ownership of heritage to the traditional owners instead of assuming the role of protectors. As such, the heritage owner resumed the position of custodial to the traditional land. These custodials of the land are intimate with the environment they live in, and as such are instrumental in the understanding of how past society lived. It is a kinder, more considerate type of archaeological practice that reflect the type of CHM-based research projects that Australia and New Zealand is leading the world in. These are not new concepts, but they were able to adopt and perfected it by decolonizing archaeology and embracing equal collaboration on top of respect of the local community and the land. Perhaps one day Belize will do so as well.